Mr. Pema Tseden, Professor Françoise Robin, Madame Brigitte Duzan, Professor Robert Barnett, Professor Lim Dae Geun, friends and colleagues. I'm very pleased to welcome you to Hong Kong and to our university for today's symposium, Translating Pema Tseden. This is another landmark in the continuing partnership and friendship of our distinguished guests here today with our colleagues in the arts faculty of the Hong Kong Baptist University. For a few years now, we have met regularly to celebrate and work towards understanding human goodness in the work of artists and community builders, and the Tibetan cinema and cultural production in general in the context of ethnic minorities has been one of our focus research areas. In today's discussion, we will hear Mr. Pema Tseden's translators and scholars share their insights on these issues. Mr. Pema Tseden is an old friend of ours, colleagues of the Contemporary Chinese Cultures and the Anthropocene Research Consortium, chaired by Professor Choy Chung Lo of our Department of Humanities and Creative Writing, have written about his films since the early stage of his directorial career. In 2014, they organized our first symposium on his films, fictions and literary translations, and collaborated with the Hong Kong Asian Film Festival in a retrospective that showed the entire repertoire of his feature films, including his lesser-known works. Until now, that has remained the only such event in the world. Since then, the research group initiated and facilitated a similar event in Seoul, presented by Professor Lim Dae Geun of Hankook Foreign Languages University and his colleagues in 2015, and one in Atlanta in 2017 by Professor Wu Shu Chin and her colleagues from Agnes Scott College. Another symposium that took place only 2 days ago in Nanjing was also initiated by our colleagues at its preliminary stage. The Anthropocene Research Group has also edited a special issue on Mr. Pema Tseden's films in the Journal of Chinese Cinemas as the first organized study of a Tibetan director in a reputable international journal, and another special issue in the Chinese journal Suqiao Academic, which is also the first organized study of a Tibetan artist in Chinese on the Social Sciences Academy core journal list. Beside this, 2 of our colleagues in the arts faculty are translators of Mr. Pema Tseden's films and short stories, including his most celebrated work, Talo, and we've regularly screened films that he has directed or produced. We are thankful for his confidence in us and for trusting his most important work to our colleagues. The friendship we have with him is the best testimony of the common commitment to humanity that exists between artists and scholars. That is why, when our colleagues and students received news of his success in being awarded Best Adapted Screenplay Golden Horse Award in 2016 for Talo, and Best Screenplay for Jinpa, produced by Hong Kong's very own Wong Kar-wai at this year's Orizzonti program of the Venice International Film Festival, and the nomination for Best Director in the coming Golden Horse Award later this month, we rejoiced, as in the success of one of our own. Likewise, Mr. Pema Tseden's translators and scholars who will speak this afternoon are no strangers to us. Our colleagues and students have found much inspiration in the works of Madame Brigitte Duzan, Professor Françoise Robin, Professor Robert Barnett, Professor Lim Dae Geun, and Dr. Victor Fan. I'm particularly proud to tell you that as I speak now, simultaneous interpreting into Tibetan is provided for our Tibetan-speaking friends here by Mr. Tsemdo from the interpreting booth. As far as we know, this is the first occasion in academic events in universities here in Hong Kong where interpreting into Tibetan is provided. We champion linguistic and cultural diversity and always try to do as much as we can in this respect. I'm sure many of you here still fondly remember that in 2015, the great Uyghur novelist, Mr. Memtimin Hoshur, gave his talk in this very room in his native Uyghur, with consecutive interpreting by our colleagues. In fact, our translation program, under the headship of Dr. Robert Neither, has already introduced Spanish into its undergraduate curriculum and recruited expertise in French, Russian, Japanese, Basque, and Uyghur into its teaching and research team, as well as provided training in community interpreting for interpreters of South Asian languages here in Hong Kong. We're committed to the values of internationalism and to Hong Kong's signature openness to embracing cultural and linguistic diversity. In my own research, I've worked on small nation cinemas and cinemas of culturally diverse communities in larger nations. How cinema and other art forms promote human well-being, both in mind and body, is a topic that is very close to my heart. For this reason, I understand how important it is to direct critical attention to the relationship between creativity, community empowerment, and capacity building. Therefore, I extend my best wishes to those involved in this two-day program and congratulate you in advance for the success of these events. Likewise, I wish you well for the continued collaboration between our faculty and our Tibetan friends and international scholars. Again, a warm welcome to Hong Kong and to our university. I wish you a very fruitful and happy two-day event. Thank you.
Okay, filmmaker Pema Tseden, all the honorable guests, well, Professor Robbie Barnett, Professor Brigitte Duzan, and Professor Lim, and Professor Robin, and colleagues and our dean, welcome to this symposium on translating Pema Tseden. I guess our connection with Director Pema Tseden began in 2008, when I had the chance to go to Beijing to interview him there. And then in the year 2010, when his movie Old Dog was released through the International Film Festival in Hong Kong, we also somewhat hijacked him to come to this campus to show us some private screening of his old movies, as well as have some small discussions with students and colleagues in our department. So somehow it developed a long-term relationship between our research consortium and Pema Tseden's film crew and his works. So on behalf of the Steering Committee for Contemporary Chinese Cultures and the Anthropocene Research Consortium, we have a very long name. So somehow we simply shorten it as, what is that in Chinese? Research Consortium, 研究同盟. But I find out we haven't had a logo yet, so somehow we don't really have an official status yet. So somehow, even I welcome you in an unofficial way, but my kind of welcome is sincere. This symposium on translation, in a way, is interesting because I've been asked to do the welcoming speech, but somehow I'm not a professional translator, even though I engage as an amateur translator for some time. But I have high respect for translator. My learning experience benefit a lot from translation because I read those continental philosophies work and all that through translation. And I guess all translators are kind of bilingual or multilingual overachiever. And science studies somewhat demonstrated bilingual people or multilingual people even usually live longer than monolingual people. So I guess that explains why the translator, professional translator, good translator, as all of you like, should have a longer life because you would be required to do more work, to do more good translation for us. So I guess this is just the way I kind of looking for good translation work, and through which we somehow learn a lot and also can have the channel to discuss more about the work of Pema Tseden. And indeed, I think what translation could be understood in a metaphorical sense. So it's not just about interlingual kind of rendition from one language to another, but also somewhat, the movement or the action going in between worlds and to kind of make sense of the other world and try to illuminate different worlds to one another. So in that sense, I guess, the critics of all kind of texts, as well as filmmakers themselves are also translators, because they try to make sense of one world to another. So once again, on behalf of this unofficial research consortium, I welcome all of you, and hopefully, we can have a very fruitful evening or afternoon, to have kind of discussions that somehow could create, more innovative kind of perspective, to look at Pema Tseden's work as well as something, beyond. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lo. Last but not least, Dr. Robert Neither, Head of the Translation Program and Associate Professor of Translation, will also express his warmest welcome.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, friends. On behalf of the Translation Program and the Center for Translation here at HKBU, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you today to this symposium on translating Pema Tseden, and I think we're in for a really interesting afternoon of discussion. I'd like to extend in particular a special welcome to Pema Tseden himself. As has been said before, he has been to Hong Kong Baptist University before, I think about 4 years ago, and so we're delighted and honored that he is able to be with us here again today. His presence makes this symposium all the more special. The symposium brings together writing, film, and translation, a nexus of interests represented by Pema Tseden himself. For he's not only a filmmaker and writer, but also a translator between Chinese and Tibetan. Today's symposium is indeed special. It's a really rare opportunity that brings a wide variety of different languages and cultures together in dialogue. Tibetan, Chinese, Spanish, French, Korean, and of course also English, all will figure in our discussions today in a variety of combinations. And that all these different translators can come together in one place in the presence of the author himself, I think is a remarkable achievement and a very exciting opportunity for exchange and collaboration. The theme of minority translation studies has become an increasing area of interest in translation studies. And in fact, the arts faculty's research niche, it's relatively newly established, has minority studies as one of its sub-themes. And I think it's particularly fitting, therefore, that Tibetan culture and the Tibetan experience, which is something that is very seldom addressed in our Hong Kong context, as others have said, should form such a central part of today's symposium. So our event is called Translating Pema Tseden, and that ing, that ing in the title is important. For whilst we shall of course be discussing translations, we will also be discussing that ing, the process of translating, and the way in which different translators, each in their own ways, engage with the author's work. In the process, enacting not only an interlingual, but also, as KC was talking about, a cultural translation. In closing, I would like to thank all of those who made this possible, particularly the person who has asked me not to mention her name specifically. So anyway, you know who I'm talking about, I think, who has worked absolutely tirelessly to bring this event to fruition, and indeed all the other events that are happening in this series. So once again, welcome to everybody. May I wish the symposium the very best of success. Thank you.
Our next speaker is from Korea, Professor Lim Dae Geun. Sorry, I can't pronounce it in Korean. He's a professor of Chinese interpretation and translation and global culture and contents. He's also the Dean and Director of Public Affairs of World Cultural Creativity Research Center, and also Director of Taiwan Research Center and Hong Kong University of Foreign Studies. His main research areas include Chinese language cinemas and interactions of Asian popular cultures and cultural creative industries. His recent publications include the Korean reception of Wai Dae Geun's films and Trans Identity, or I think I should pronounce it as Transidentity, concept and genre, characterization, storytelling, and discourse. Let's welcome Professor Lin to talk about translating from Chinese into Korean.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Choy. Please understand, I'd like to speak my paper in Chinese because my first foreign language is Chinese, and I have prepared my paper in Chinese. So, Professor Jessica, I think, will help me translate my Chinese into English. Okay, thank you. 不好意思，前一页，不是上一页，最前面的 ，OK，今天我的题目呢是西藏的说话人，是 storyteller，万马彩丹，还有活佛、卓玛和一帮人的语言，好，next page，这就是韩国万马彩丹的第一本小说集，就是马尼水晶晶的桥的韩文版的封面。作者应该是万马彩丹，译者呢是金美宪，不是我自己翻译的。本来我想我自己来翻译，但是其实我翻译了这本书的小小的一部分。但是我耽误了1-2年的时间，然后我真的没有办法我自己翻译下去，因为我做这个大学里的工作比较多一点，所以我想这样的话我永远翻译不了这个他的小说，所以我干脆让一个学生专门学习翻译的去这个翻译这本小说了。但是翻译这本书，然后出版这本小说集的整个过程里面，我都介入了，所以我敢说这个我有资格，我可以说这个翻译的这个整个内容然后我出版这一本小说集之前，最后面加了一篇文章，我自己写的，就是对这本小说的一种讲解吧，所以我今天要发言的是把这个讲解来翻译成中文的，然后这一本小说集呢，在韩国就是今年10月份，就是上个月嘛，就是上个月刚刚出版的，所以很热腾腾的一本书。好，那么我们OK， 然后，那我先给大家介绍一下，其实这个内容我昨天晚上也介绍的，我跟这个Pema Tseden初次见面是在2014年在釜山国际电影节上见过面的，我们的 Professor Jessica 给我介绍的这个万马彩丹，然后我就为导演准备了一个小小规模的影展，next please，然后我2015年1月10到11号2天里在首尔艺术电影院 举办了一个西藏电影万马才旦影展。那时候我们共有7部影片，包括短片2部短片和5部长片，放映了。那时候只是2天而已，但是超过300个观众积极来观看了这个导演和他的电影了。这是当时的这个海报，然后这是当时的一个宣传单，OK， 就是介绍这个的宣传单，这样子。当时我们又举行了一个小小的这个对谈，好，这是跟我一起拍的，就是首尔市中心。当时导演是很年轻的，我也是很年轻的，我们只是在3、4年里，老了这样子了，OK， 抱歉，然后OK， 下面。这篇文章的第2部分呢，就是我想介绍万马才旦给韩国的读者，所以万马才旦的出生和他的成长和他的为人等等，我来这个介绍了。但是这部分我不用多说了，但是我想指的是关于万马才旦的几条。信息都在网上，我们可以找得到，但是这里面有很多地方有错，所以有些部分我不能相信，所以我这一次这个写这篇文章的时候，我用微信一一问过这个万马才旦导演，然后我得到了比较更正确的信息来这个更正了这个网上的这个错误的信息。好，我们下面一直下面。好，下面，我不用说，因为我抓紧时间，我直接这个进入这个第3部分。OK， 第3部分我呢这样想是我虽然我读完了他的第1本小说，就是曼尼什静静的桥。但是这本小说里，我发现了他的小说呢，是反映着一种人生的寓言，就是 allegory。这本小说集里面的故事呢，大部分发生在西藏的一个幽静的小村子里，那里有西藏人的生活，如父母、朋友、爱情、喇嘛、放羊娃等等。他们的人生呢，不是茫然的超越，不是圣洁的，有相遇，有离别，有擦肩而过，有遗憾等等。那儿如同其他任何地方一样，承载着人的一生。比方说，我最动人的，我最佩服的小说，可以说是《第9个男人》。如果有机会的话，各位老师、各位同学们一定要读一读这本小说，我尽力推荐。这个第9个男人呢，淋漓尽致地展现了西藏人千姿百态的形象。这个主人公是雍措，他已经跟
你坐过来。
抱歉。他已经跟8个男人一起生活过，但是这个8个男人都离开他了，然后他最后遇到了第9个男人，但是他本来不想跟这第9个男人说以前的一些男人，但是第9个男人本来不想听，但是他喝醉之后一定要逼他说这个以前的男人是怎么样的人， 这8个男人呢，我的声音太大吗？是这个原因。哦，这8个男人呢，分别是还俗的僧人、被女人抛弃的男子、卖珊瑚的人、货车司机、英俊的小伙、放羊娃、霸男和独生子。然后第9个男人是小学教师。从他们的称呼上就能知道他们的人物定位，每个人都有或多或少的存在的不足。可以吗？
声音小点可以。
声音小点。
不，我说他的声音小点。
OK，
现在可以说一下。
然后这第9个男人终于也离开了这个雍措了。那么8个男人象征着什么呢？抱歉，这个要操作这个，我干脆过去那边。
你想
怎么样？
直接去。
我待在那边看。
在那边。
你可以。OK， 这8个男人是雍措所遇见的男人呢，就是在直白地展现我们人生的allegory，人生就是对第1个男人象征着宗教，因为还俗的僧人嘛，第2个男人象征着爱情，这样，宗教、爱情、财务、他乡、外貌、性爱、权力和知识的追求，人生就是把雍措一样毫不犹豫地奉献出自己的身体，人生就是在追赶这些的时候，这些又把我们给骗了，头也不回地离开了我们，是这个样子。这是引文的部分。所以我相信万马才旦的小说充满了这种对整个人生和世界的预言。然后第2个小说呢是陌生人，呈现了另外一种的预言。有一天村子里突然来一个自称是来找卓玛的一帮人，他想寻找他心中的卓玛。住在村子里的卓玛一一出现，每当卓玛出现的时候，他都给100块钱。然而到最后那个他要求的要找的卓玛还是没有出现。就这样一帮人匆匆地离开了这里。所以高的、矮的、老的、少的，贱的嘛、近的、抽的，什么样的都有。但是这本小说里我们找不到这个一帮人从哪里来的，为什么来的？主要要找这个卓玛的原因是什么，都没有这样的理由。所以我看万马才旦没有给读者提供具体的信息，呈现的是一个没有文脉 context 的故事。万马才旦的故事接近于无文脉主义，不明确地指出故事本身的起因和结果，故事就好像我们人生和生活中的某一部分一样，不经意地展现开来。所以我们可以说，有些小说呢叙事性非常非常强，有些小说呢，比方说抒情小说，或者这个自我小说，5分钟自我小说呢叙事性比较弱，但是我看万马才旦的小说站在这2个里面的中间，我想是这样子。然后还是有别于传统小说手法的，所以我们熟悉的小说呢，通常要经过人物的出场、矛盾的产生、矛盾达到顶点，再到解决矛盾这样一系列的过程。矛盾处在人物和人物之间，也处在人物的内心。无论怎样，一般来说，故事是同属于时间和空间的。OK。然后万马才旦的故事常常是通过结尾给我们以某种暗示，对卓玛到底是谁的疑问呢，在最后被揭示出来。这个西藏最代表性的女性的名字存在于世界上的任何一个地方， 陌生的一帮人离开了，商店售货员卓玛离开的地方诞生了新的生命，那个孩子的名字也是卓玛。那么那个寻找的欲望的尾声，就是卓玛存在我们生活中的每个地方。无法理解西藏世界的一帮人，最终也未能找到心中的卓玛而突然消失。即使那里存在着21位卓玛，所有的类型的卓玛都有。无法理解世界的我们，对所有类型的追求，即使就在我们身边，我们却无法认识发现它，而向着新的追求进发。我们是无法认识世界、无法找到卓玛的糊涂的众生。万马才旦的小说就是以这样的方式来预言我们的人生。还有第4个部分呢，是我想我抽出了这个3种代表人物形象了。这就是这个活佛、卓玛和一帮人。万马才旦OK。活佛呢，在马铃石静静的翘，乌金的牙齿，脑海中的2个人中都有出现。活佛呢，象征着西藏的传统，西藏固有的历史和文化的顶峰就是活佛。但是活佛不是假作高尚的存在，活佛无论何时都存在于西藏人们的身边，与他们一同面对困难。活佛是慈祥的存在。马铃石静静的桥里的活佛呢，一种存在于西藏人毫无距离感的，没有距离感的，与他们一同体味喜怒哀乐的存在。然后乌金的牙齿呢，活佛是我小学的朋友 ，OK。脑海中的2个人呢，进一步描述了根本无法解决世界上存在的问题的活佛形象。阿妈冷错，像个半疯子一样的生活。村子里的人把他带到了活佛的面前。卓玛呢，在陌生人、午后和死亡的颜色中登场。陌生人里的卓玛象征了存在于我们生活每一个地方的人物，然而我们却无法看出如卓玛一样的人们的欲望。午后里的卓玛是安本的女朋友，卓玛是每个人都想达成的人生目标。死亡的颜色的卓玛是尼玛的女朋友，但是呢，尼玛有他的弟弟，他的弟弟达瓦是有点不正常的人。尼玛在卓玛的面前照顾他照顾得非常好，但是卓玛不在的时候呢，尼玛非常束缚他的弟弟了，所以后来卓玛知道这个事情，开始不喜欢这个谁呀？这个尼玛，然后他们之间有些这个矛盾了，比方说，然后后来最后这个达瓦是死去的。所以我想，这个达瓦跟卓玛都是2个欲望。达瓦呢是象征着我们期待不要在我们旁边的一种东西，不想让它留在我们旁边的一种东西。卓玛是我们一直追求的一种东西，是我看象征着这2个东西。所以在我们的人生中，达瓦和卓玛是无法并存的存在。显而易见的也是，任何一个整体不能被另一个整体取代的存在。得到卓玛的前提条件是达瓦的消失，但是达瓦消失了，卓玛也没来到我身边。难以捉摸的欲望，麻烦的存在，即使消失了，也不让人觉得有成就。与我同在的，当我承认希望实现的欲望本身时，我们虽然会不安，但是却找到了2者共存的道路。因此，糊涂的人生只有看到死亡的颜色，才能领悟其中的真理。然后一帮人是OK，Thank you 一帮人，然后第3个是一帮人 ，OK， 那我不用多说了，OK， 是这样的， 然后我想拿来一种概念 displacement 来说明了这个一般人，还有跟西藏人出去外地的时候经历过的一些经验了，OK。所以万马才旦的一些小说呢，描写了西藏人正在碰撞着身份性危机的问题，OK，好，就这样，就这样，我不用多说了，是这样，韩国的读者呢，我相信会，拜读万马才旦的小说之后，我会得到非常动人的一种感觉，这样好，然后下面是我以前这个组织的一些华语电影、中国电影的影展，如这个蔡明亮电影，然后台湾 Film Festival，还有中国的年轻的导演的这个中国艺术电影展，我们在这边放映了一个西藏导演宋泰嘉的影片，然后我下周还要举办一个小规模的这个亚洲短片影展 Short and Thick Asia Film Festival，所以我想努力一下，以后也尽量给韩国读者和观众介绍这个万马才旦跟其他的藏族的这个小说家或导演的这个作品。好，谢谢大家。
Our third paper will be presented by my colleague at HKBU. Here comes Marin-Lacarta. She's a translator and assistant professor in our translation program. She received her PhD in Chinese Studies and in Translation and Intercultural Studies from the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations in Paris and the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Her translations of Chinese literature into Basque and Spanish include works by Pema, San Chongwen, Mo Yan, Yan Lianke, Yang Lian, Wu Shiying, Liu Nao. Her research interests cover literary translation, modern and contemporary Chinese literature, global literary flows, literary reception, translation history, agents of translation, and digital publishing. Today she's going to talk about her experience of translating from Chinese into Spanish. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about my experience translating Tarlo into Spanish, like Howard Choy mentioned, which is the first translation of Pema Tseden's work into Spanish. I already talked a little bit about it last night, but today I'll try to do a more detailed analysis of my translation. So translating Tarlo was a very enjoyable experience, and translating for me involves close reading, often a cyclic close reading that I conduct on my own first, and it's cyclic because I go back and forth between the source text and the target text. After that, of course, I have to distance myself from the source text and focus more on the target text. But at a later stage, the cyclic reading comes back and becomes collaborative when I get feedback from others. I don't always get feedback from the publisher or from the main editor, but I do when I publish with Hacker. That's the way we pronounce the strange name of this ebook publisher. So which is why one of the reasons why I enjoy publishing with them. And I've published another translation with them before. So this is a non-profit publisher led by 3 translators who publish only in ebook format. And I have also been doing some research, ethnographic research about how they work together, how they collaborate. And in this case, 3 different people, all of them translators, read my translation of Tarlo. So I got feedback, especially from the first 2 readers. Then the third one was the person who was formatting the ebook and who also spotted a couple of typos so we could improve the translation. So in this case, it is not just an individual cyclic close reading. It becomes a collaborative revision process. which ideally I think that's the way it should be. But it's not always the case. Sometimes I don't get feedback at all, or things that change without consulting me at all. Fortunately, that doesn't happen often, right? This cyclic close reading helps us think about the said and the unsaid in each work. Or I could also call it the explicit and the implicit, which is why I chose to talk about this in relation to Tarlo today. Some scholars have spoken about how different languages make the same idea explicit in different ways. So linguistically, the explicit and implicit are different in different languages. But I would add that the author chooses their own explicit and implicit, their own idiolects, or more generally referred to as style. So even if each language is different, the translator has to be aware of the salient features of an author's style and distinguish between decisions made by the author, often consciously, and linguistic features. Because we want to keep those salient features or recreate those features somehow in the target language, even if the language works differently. So my talk is divided into two parts. First, I'll talk about the said, the explicit, the obvious, the repetitive in Pema Tseden's Tarlo. And then in the second part, I'll discuss the implicit, the hidden, the unsaid, or the symbolic. So for those of you who have not read Tarlo or have not seen the film, let me tell you very briefly what the story is about. So Tarlo is a shepherd who lives in the mountains alone and who has his hair in a braid. So everyone calls him Xiao Pianzi. Ponytail in Jessica Young's English translation, el trenzas in the Spanish translation. So when the township police ask everyone in the region to register for a new identity card, Ponytail, or Tarlo, has to go to the city to take a photograph for the identity card. And the owner of the photographic studio, seeing his untidy hair, asks him to go to a barbershop to have his hair washed. The barbershop is opposite this photographic studio, and at the barbershop, Ponytail meets a girl with short hair who will charm him, and let's say that will be the beginning of his troubles. In the city, Tarlo's kindness and morality will be corrupted. Charmed by this girl, he sells his sheep, the sheep he takes care of, most of which do not belong to him, and takes the money to the city, to this girl, because the plan is that they will escape together and they will go to Lhasa together, right? But the following morning, the girl disappears, and so does the money. So he returns to the village as a different person, let's say. Let's look at the said first. So Pema Tseden tends to repeat lexical terms or phrases in his stories, and the syntax and vocabulary are very simple, which is something that Madame Duzan already mentioned. So they're not complicated. But this gives a storytelling effect to the narrative, and some of these repetitions were important to maintain in the translation. Some of them were too much in Spanish because we repeat less than in Chinese, we repeat even less than in English. So I had to find a balance between them and also distinguish which ones are more important, which ones I really should keep and which ones I can play with or I can find some variation, right? So I'll give there are many examples of this. I'll just give a few very quickly. So you have an idea of what I mean. So for example, in the dialogues, you have this storytelling effect with this repetition, with this 所张问, 总张说, 所张问, 总张说, and so on, right? So I wanted to keep that effect. And I added a little bit of variation. So for example, some of these 说 become answer in Spanish, or one of them, those are in gray, or one of them becomes order in gray, right? But you still have the 所张 and the 总张, you still have this repeated throughout. So you have that rhythm and that storytelling effect, right? I couldn't do this throughout the whole story. That would be a bit too much. So maybe that doesn't mean I did it all the time. So here I would omit some of them. I would keep other parts. Of course, I had to keep that I had to keep that one, but I did omit some of them when it was too much. So I had to play with that, keep a balance, but it was very important for me to keep most of these repetitions, to keep that effect in the translation. Another example of repetition which was extremely important to keep was the mirror. So Jin's the mirror appears 17 times, both in the source text and the target text. Of course, while I was translating, I didn't count them, or I wasn't aware that I was keeping all of them. But I was aware that, so this is my analysis afterwards, but I was aware that this was a very important image in two scenes. So when Tarlo goes to the barbershop twice in the story, he is talking to the girl, he's sitting down, and she's standing behind him, and they talk to each other through the mirror. And so we have that perspective of the mirror, and we see both of them talking to each other. It would be completely different if we had the perspective of each of the characters, right? So even if it's repeated constantly, he said through the mirror, or she looked at him through the, I had the feeling that I must keep all these mirrors in, right? So even if we repeat this in Spanish, it doesn't matter. The mirror is there every single time, right? And these are things I also notice when I look at my own translation. Another example of repetition, a different example, is the recitation. So when Tarlo is at the police station, he recites, so the chief of police doesn't ask him, oh, you went to primary school? Oh, yes, I went to primary school, and I still remember what I learned. So I remember Remin Fu, I remember Serve the People, Mao Zedong's speech, and he recites the whole speech at the beginning of the story. He does it at the end as well, and to show the other policemen that he is able that he has a very good memory, which is one of his skills. So what we see is, we also see, so this gives a cyclic effect to the story, and it also shows how different Tarlo is at the beginning and at the end of the story. This becomes even more obvious in the film, because in the film he has changed so much that he's not able to recite it anymore. He loses his memory. He cannot remember, right? Because he has changed so much that even one of the characteristics of this personality has changed. So some of these repetitions might have different functions, but in general they intensify orality, musicality, and the storytelling effect. I'm going to move on to the second part, the set. Oh no, hold on. I'm still looking at this set, not the end set yet. I have another example about the set. So we were looking at repetitions until now, right? But another example of the set is Tarlo's straightforward personality, because he will say everything he thinks most of the times, and he will ask many questions and say everything that crosses his mind. So he will ask sometimes innocent questions like, what's an identity card? And why do I need one, right? 身份证是什么? And the policeman explains, 有了身份证，你去了站里，别人就知道你是谁了，就知道你是哪儿的人了。我自己知道我是谁，不就行了吗？ Right? He insists and says everything he thinks. He also asks the policeman how he knows that he's a good person. How can he distinguish between good and bad people? And can you explain that to me? 你真的给我说说你们是怎么看出好人和坏人的? So he's very straightforward. Another example would be when the girl asks him how many sheep he has and how much money he makes. And he just met the girl. They don't know each other, and he doesn't filter any information. He would just say everything, right? So at the same time, in these fragments, we see that he's also a naive or innocent or gullible person, untouched by modernity and the capitalist world and so on. So he doesn't know about the modern world and life in the city. So there's that shock of the encounter with the modern world for a traditional Tibetan person, which is a common topic in Pema Tseden's work. And I'd like to move on now to the unsaid. The shadow of the Cultural Revolution. So I already mentioned that when Tarlo is at the police station, the police chief is surprised to hear he went to primary school, and then he recites Mao's speech, Serve the People, right? Through that, we know that he grew up during the Cultural Revolution, right? That's one of the implicits in the story. He also says he's an orphan, that his parents died when he was very young. We don't know how they died. We know they died during the Cultural Revolution too. Tarlo's external changes as symbols of his internal transformation. So when Tarlo goes to the city and walks into this photo studio, the owner of the studio looks at him with suspicion, and everyone in the room, all the customers, look at him surprised and stare at him. The photographer also tells him his hair is untidy, so he has to go and wash it. After he washes his hair, the short-haired girl, who's the one who washes his hair, will say how attractive he looks. Then the photographer will also say how attractive he looks. Then the police chief will also say, "Oh, you have changed a lot. Just go in once in the city and you look nice." So that's the first time we notice some external transformation. But the most radical transformation happens later in the story. When Tarlo gives the girl the money that he got from selling all this sheep, she asks him to cut his ponytail so nobody can recognize him. While she does so, it's the first time that Tarlo is speechless. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't agree or disagree. He's just silent. So from that straightforward, very talkative person, he's suddenly completely silent. But his only reaction is that he takes the ponytail that falls on the floor after she cuts it and keeps it in his pocket. After she disappears, he goes back to the village, and he's able to speak again because he will tell the police chief, "I have become a bad person." And then the police chief will ask him to recite Mao's speech, and he's able to remember and recite in the story. And the police chief insists that cutting his ponytail doesn't make him a bad person. He just looks different. But he's different from the outside and from the inside already. But at the same time, he's aware of it. He keeps the ponytail to remind him of who he once was. At the same time, the hair is a symbol of tradition and modernity because we have Tarlo with the long hair and the girl with short hair. And Tarlo is shocked to see that she has short hair, and she says, "Oh, it's in fashion. That's what we do in the city." So tradition and modernity are symbolized by hairstyle in this case. So cutting his hair can also mean giving up his traditional and honest morality and being corrupted by modernity or vice or capitalism or however you want to define it. The last unsaid would be the short-haired girl because we don't know much about her. And this has to do with what Professor Lim was saying about the lack of context or some lack of information, right? We don't know much about her. We only know that she dreams to get out of that township and has no other aspirations, so she says that she wants to get out. So if we read the last line, it says, 那我带你去，咱们可以去拉萨、北京、上海、广州、香港，什么地方都可以去. She just wants to get out. But is she a bad person? So the first time Tarlo meets her, he thinks that he has encountered a bad person, and he will tell so. When he sees the police chief, he says, "I think I have met someone, a bad person." And the policeman says, "Well, you need proof if you think so." Is that why he does what he does? to get proof. I mean, that would be one way to understand it. But I don't think so. I think because in the process, he becomes a criminal, a thief, because he sells the sheep that do not belong to him. So is he perhaps in love? He also says at one point, speaking to the police chief, that no woman in the village will take him seriously or will pay attention to him. So in this process of falling in love and committing a crime, he loses his identity, his morality, he's corrupted, but he's aware of it and keeps the ponytail. He doesn't throw it away. It's his memory of who he once was. He used to be a good person. He insists that he has become a bad person. So I'll just conclude saying that the exercises of cyclic close reading and thinking about the explicit and implicit are part of the translation process. They are not only steps that integrate the process and help us come up with a successful translation, they also offer a reading or an interpretation of the story, as I have tried to show in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maialen. Our last paper of this panel today will be by Haben. She has a Tibetan name, Chu Ni Wang Wu. So Haben teaches Tibetan language and literature at the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations in Paris. Over the past 20 years, she has focused her interest on Tibetan contemporary literature as well as the emerging Tibetan cinema, inquiring into their use and their regimes of representation of being Tibetan in a specific context of the PRC. She has also been following closely the rise of a Tibetan feminist literary scene. Recently, her research projects have also dealt with the Tibetan refugee population in France. She has published articles on Tibetan cultures and translated many literary works, including poetry, short stories, and novels into French and English, as well as having subtitled Tibetan films into French. Today, she's going to talk about translating Tibetan into English and French. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for inviting us to this very wonderful place. And it's a great opportunity to see Pema Tseden again, Jessica, Robbie, Brigitte, and to discover new people and new translators of Pema Tseden's work. Well, maybe among you, I'm the one who's been knowing Pema Tseden for the longest time. I can pride myself with that. I think I met him in 2002 or 2003. So imagine the change, you know. So actually, I met him because I was interested in literature, and I hardly knew that he was making films. But when I met him to discuss about the perspective of translating his work, I think I was in the course of doing my PhD or something. He said, well, I might be going to Cannes. You might see me in Cannes one day. I said, what? You know, we were in 2002, and I didn't know he was making films. And then I discovered he was in the process of, becoming a trained film director. And indeed, in 2005, I was able to meet him in Paris because he came to show the Silent Holy Stone, and maybe Brigitte was there too, in the Chinese filmmakers group. And so ever since then, we've met regularly, and he was very kind this summer to let me attend the shooting of his film in the making. So that was a great honor, and I want to thank him for that. I also met Brigitte Duzan when we became interested. She became interested in Pema Tseden's films, as she explained. And so in 2011, I remember we were in New York, Pema and I, for another conference. And this is when I had forgotten about this story, about these, little dots and everything. So yes, so he gave me the book and he said, okay, you translate that, Brigitte translates that. So I said, yes, okay, we will do as you say. He's a kind of a bossy author, and we are very obedient, I guess. So okay, we did as he had commended, and Brigitte has told about the conversations we had. Sometimes I was a bit impatient, I must confess, with Chinese renderings of Tibetan culture through the Chinese language, but that's how it is. And then we sent it to a French publisher called Piquet, and Piquet is maybe, we should also pay a tribute to Mr. Piquet because he's a wonderful French publisher who's been publishing Asian literature, essays and fiction also. For the last maybe 30 years, he's the foremost Asia book specialist in France, and I may embellish a little bit my memory, but I think I sent him the manuscript, and maybe 2 days later I had a phone call. Usually you have to call them 20 times before they say yes or no. Usually it's no if you have to call them 20 times. But then he called me and said, I want to publish this book. No problem at all. He was very enthusiastic, and he loved the story Snow, so Kang. This is how it ended. It was published in 2012. And then because it was quite a success, it was republished in a smaller format in 2016. So this is the book that you've seen here. Also, I'm talking here as a film subtitler because I've been lucky enough to, I think I have subtitled in French, I think with the exception of one film, Sacred Arrow, I think I have subtitled all the films because here again in France we are quite lucky to have an strong interest in cinema and in Tibetan cinema too. I mean, quality cinema, I should say. So Pema Tseden's film being good, you find enough people interested in his films. So as early as 2012, there was a retrospective with his 5 first films. And for this, they asked me to prepare the translation. So I've been able to look closely into 2 different types of translation. It's not the same job. Translating a book, subtitling a film is very different. But in my mind, it's all a bit mixed, and I think I will try to talk about these 2 dimensions today. For me as a translator, I think I'm the only one here who translates from Tibetan and not from Chinese. So this is also quite a different feature. So what I would like to, I'm not going to give too many examples, but I like to maybe when you translate either the film or the short stories from Tibetan, one has to be aware that, in the first place, Tibetans, especially the cultural brokers of Tibetan society, like Pema Tseden, they are very, very attached to their, and rightly so, to their amazing civilizations. Its literary past, its philosophy, its religion, and this civilization has had little contact with the West until very recently. They had cultural contacts with Buddhist India, so ancient India, but since then, Tibetans have been quite self-referential in terms of culture or language as well. So they have relied on their own capacity and resources to develop it. They haven't been also colonized by Western powers, so they haven't been fed with many Western cultural references or to the cultural, and the cultural world is fully Tibetan, if not Indo-Tibetan, traditionally. Maybe they are cultural imperialists because they have exported their culture to Mongolia, to High Asia, so their culture is a little bit like the Western culture, or maybe Chinese culture now. At least Tibetan culture was a triumphant imperialist culture, at least, soft imperialism, exporting Tibetan Buddhism. So, and suddenly they are, and their culture was not so contaminated with no judgment involved. It was not tainted with many Western elements or Chinese elements, for that matter, for many hundreds of years. Of course, things have changed since the annexation of Tibet by the PRC, and it has meant a forced opening to Chinese Maoist culture and language to begin with, and then slowly with an opening to the Western culture through the Chinese language filter translations of films and books. And a proof that Tibetans were not very interested, in, for instance, Chinese culture is you can hardly find any Chinese texts being translated into Tibetan in 1,000 years. There's hardly anything. They've translated thousands of Sanskrit texts, but Chinese texts we have very, very few. Even the big novels of the, Qing dynasty, there's nothing. Was not very interesting for Tibetans, I suppose. I don't know. So what Pema Tseden wants to show is not a global culture. So we are not, with like an American culture or Japanese, Korean, which more or less everyone in the world has seen snippets of. What he wants to show us is a culture which is difficult to connect with when you're not part of this culture. So I think part of we have challenges as translators, cultural translators, but I think Pema has challenges as someone who on the one hand wants to reach out to as many people as possible. On the other hand, he takes his inspiration from his culture, which is in a way kind of exclusive and not very, not at all known in the West. As a consequence, I think he grants a lot of space to very specific Tibetan cultural characteristics or traits in his films, for instance, and films and short stories. So in the films, you have many references to songs. They always subtitle the songs, so lyrics are very important. Theater plays a big part. Visual art also plays a big part. Buddhism plays a big part. And this is quite a challenge for us when we translate films, for instance. Short stories often mention references to popular Tibetan texts, like the Gesar epic, so the big epic of the Tibetan world is present. Tales of the Corpse is a literary tale, a long tale, which is the Vetala stories, if you like, in Sanskrit. It's also quite present, which all Tibetans know about, but nobody outside Tibet knows about. So he is a cultural broker, and he seems to have assigned himself a mission. That's how I understand Pema Tseden, showing from the inside his own Tibetan world. So not showing only from the inside, but showing its richness and diversity, especially in terms of its cultural dimension. And this is quite a challenge when you want to present it to people who absolutely no knowledge of this cultural world. And this is true of his film, this is true of his short stories. And we as translators, we are facing a similar question. You know, we are cultural and linguistic brokers, so you have these double layers of cultural brokering. So you have Pema Tseden representing his and trying to represent it in its full richness, or save what's to be saved, you know. And we are here trying also to make it available to a readership who doesn't know much. Oh my God, that's impossible. Okay, so just to give a few examples, in the Silent Mani Stones, you have Time Kunden. So you have, you know, Time Kunden. I don't think anyone outside of the Tibetan world knows who is Time Kunden. Tongxing Lama, maybe in China, you know. Hualgon, quotes by Sakya Pandita. I mean, maybe I'm the only one, and maybe Robbie here and Ron, maybe they understand what I mean, but it's really very, very fully Tibetan, internal Tibetan references. In Tarlo, you have, of course, Mao Zedong's speech, so this is a Chinese reference, and you have also a rap song. You know, nobody has really worked on this rap song, but the singer is called Dekitserang. It's very famous in Tibet, but the rap song is not any song. It's the #1 non-versified poem. It's the poem that showed the beginning of modernity in Tibetan poetry, because it's non-versified, and it was written in 1983, and it's called "A Water Full of Youth." And this is what the singer raps in the song, in the film. In Akutepa, Akutepa I don't think has been translated into English. Akutepa is one of the short stories that we have translated with Brigitte. I counted, there are 13 footnotes. You know, I looked at the footnotes. How many footnotes do we need in the Pema Tseden stories? I think the most footnotes are needed when we translate for Tibetan, because when he writes for Tibetans, he doesn't have to explain much. You know, it's like self-referential. But when he writes in Chinese, he takes a little bit more care, not more care, but he's aware of maybe the readership. So the more focused on the Tibetan readership, which I think is a very important part of his production, the more it's packed with implicit cultural references, and what do we do with that, you know? So, and there's also the language thing. So one final example is gang, so snow. So it gave its title to the book in French, Neige. So the Tibetan is gang. And then I think we haven't mentioned yet this collection of short stories in English translated by Patricia Schiaffini and Michael Monard. It was published also in 2018 at Sunny Press, New York. And so it has translations from the Chinese and from the Tibetan. And neige or gang is translated too, and it's translated as gang, like a gang, G-A-N-G. Why not? Because it's also a person's name, so it means snow, but it's a person's name. Then I remembered, you know, the first passage of this short story. Our translation is, and I think I'm quite faithful to the Tibetan, and here am I translating back into English my French translation because I didn't have time to check the Tibetan text, but I'm quite sure. It says, if the word snow refers to a very well-known winter climatic phenomenon, it's also a girl's name. Then I looked at how they had managed, because they say gang, they don't say neige, you know, so in our translation, snow refers to a climatic phenomenon. Okay, that makes sense. But if you say gang refers to a climatic phenomenon, it's a bit strange because it's a mixture of two languages. So I checked and it says, in Tibetan, gang means snow. It's also the name of a young girl. But Pema Tseden would not have to write in Tibetan, gang means snow, if he writes in Tibetan. It doesn't make sense. So it means the translator here have changed a little bit the text, like paraphrasing, I call it explanatory translation, so as to make it available or to make full sense for a Western reader. So I don't mean our choice is the best. I mean, this is the kind of dilemma we are faced with. So I think Pema Tseden is faced with the dilemma of the author. Too much explanation ruins the narration, but too little explanation makes the narration non-understandable, it opacifies. The translator, too, is faced with many dilemmas. Do we need footnotes? Do we do a glossary? Do we do a long introduction? Do we do nothing? Do we leave the text obscure? So far, in France, footnotes were, I guess it's maybe not only in France, but you said it, Brigitte. Adding footnote means like having failed as a translator. I don't know if this is, you know, the current, but that was in a full, you know, no footnote, you know, you manage. And I remember once I discussed with Pema, I subtitled the search. 1 minute. I subtitled the search. I don't know if any of you has watched the search, but I can tell you it's 1,400 lines of dialogue. It's very long. It's a long film, but with a lot of speech, with this guy, the businessman who speaks at full speed, and you have to, you know, put the subtitles. And I was really exhausted by this work, and I couldn't find, you know, the right way to translate it. And I said to Pema Tseden, please, you know, think of your subtitles. Please think of us, you know, when you make, you know, dialogues, and try to. And he said, it's your business, you know, it's not mine. Okay, so my business now is to decide whether we put footnotes or glossary or anything, and I think after this, trying to avoid footnotes, maybe I think we have to face the fact that given this double layer of cultural translation, we need quite a lot of footnotes for Tibetan, for Pema Tseden's texts. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I have to stop here, otherwise there will be snow down. I would like to start our discussion. We have a whole bunch of scholars and colleagues here for the discussion section. But I would like to invite Pema to start as a, let's hear your responses to the 4 papers we have had. Yeah. 那个万本彩蛋可以先让您开始回应一下刚才听的4个论文吗？
非常感谢香港浸会大学翻译学研究中心，然后各位翻译家、各位学者来组成这样一个会议。我觉得对我是一个纯新的认识吧。就是翻译学其实跟西藏有非常渊源的这个关系，然后西藏所有的学者在古代，翻译是他的一个基本的一个基础。就比如说这个每一个学者，他要成为一个学者，如果比别人成为学者的话，翻译是他的一个最基础的一个学识。西藏有10民学，然后其中的一个学问就叫声敏学，然后声敏学他就要学习梵文。 因为西藏文化跟梵文的这种源源不断的关系，然后所以翻译是一个最基本的东西。然后每一个学者，他要成为一个真正的学者，那么他首先要成为一个翻译家。所以通过翻译，把古代的这个佛学、佛经的很多知识，然后引到了这个西藏的整个知识的体系里面。所以我觉得翻译对于西藏文化来说是一个特别重要的事情。然后这种传承也延续到了当下，然后当下也是通过翻译接触到了很多不同种类的学科，像文学，当下也是每年都有一些不同的这个计划，然后是针对这个翻译的，会组织很多的这个翻译家，然后他们从不同的语种，比如说从英文，比如说从中文，然后如果有其他精通这个其他语种，德文、法文、西班牙文，他们会从不同的语种把文学的、自然科学的这样一些著作，然后带到这个西藏，让它成为西藏文化的一个新的学业。所以我觉得翻译特别重要，然后对我来说也是一样，我自己曾经也学过这个翻译的专业，然后当然所以也深知翻译之中的这种艰难。我觉得翻译就是比起创作，可能翻译我觉得它会面临更多的问题吧。就比如说创作或者翻译，如果你面临前面有一座大山，我觉得创作你可以绕过去，就是可以用不同的方法，然后绕到那个问题的后面。但是如果你是一个翻译者，那你就要面对这个面对这一座大山，必须要爬过这座山。所以我是深有这样的体会的，深知这个翻译的艰难的。所以这么多译者，然后把我的作品通过翻译成不同的语种，带到不同的文化的语境里面，我觉得是一个特别重要的事情。不光是对我作品的一个翻译，我觉得更重要的是，可能是通过我的作品的翻译，把我背后的自己民族的文化的东西，然后翻译到了更大的这个语境里面。所以特别感谢。然后这种翻译的事业，我觉得可能会陪伴我的一生，不单单跟自己这个之前有从事翻译的这样一个经验工作有关系，然后现在从事电影工作也会面临不同的翻译的问题。刚刚去尼王母他讲的字母的翻译，也要重新考虑，它可能跟文学的翻译或者跟其他文体的翻译，比如说科技翻译，完全不一样，它就要有一个综合的考量。所以像电影字幕的翻译，它成为一个翻译的一种新的类型，需要专门的研究它，然后才有可能让这个电影的内容意象传达得更为准确，然后让这样的意象传达得更为清晰。所以对翻译对我来说特别的重要吧。我觉得它对过去自己有过翻译的这样的经验，然后别人翻译了我的作品，然后自己也是一直跟翻译发生这样的关系。就比如说电影也是，我觉得它是首先是一个文字的一个文本，然后通过电影的手段要把它变成这个影像的语言、影像的文本。我觉得从大的方面讲，这也是一个翻译的一个另外的一个体现。所以能够听到就是不同的语种的翻译者对自己的作品的解读，然后讲述他们翻译过程的这种感受，对不同文化语境的处理，我觉得可能对我，无论是对我写作还是对我自身，是一个重新认知的过程。所以非常感谢今天有这样一个机会。
好，谢谢万马。大家都知道啊，就万马本人也是在不断的翻译，像他说的，翻译会伴随他一生，因为他 本身就是双语写作的，他在汉语跟藏语之间翻译，他的创作也是，如果我们用翻译作为一个比喻的话，他也是在文学，尤其是小说跟电影之间自己互相翻译。好，下面我时间不多，就把时间交给在座的所有的 discussants. So I'm now going to invite our discussants to give comments to the 4 papers today. Yeah, anybody? Casey, yes, please.
Just some quick questions, I guess. Well, or probably were just observation. Echoes, well, strong echoes. Anyway, I guess, well, thanks for all the very interesting presentations. I guess, well, all the speakers, well, somehow kind of try to deal with a certain context against which the work of Pema Tseden were translated into a different context, right? So, so when you all would have been talking about context, well, so it strikes me, well, when I saw Professor Lin's PowerPoint, and of course he moved very quickly, and then I saw a work where it struck me that it was, well, non-contextualism, right? So I guess, well, most of the translator would deal with, well, the transfer from one context to another, and how to make that text, well, transport, well, from one context to another, well, and we are all somehow bound by a certain kind of specific context. Well, so is non-contextualism ever possible, or are we talking about trans-contextualism, or? But in a way, well, when I have second thought, well, maybe contextual could be possible. It's just like, well, in Buddhist thinking, well, we have an expert here. Well, the realm of emptiness, well, could happen, right? Even though we somehow go beyond all the empirical realities or different imaginary worlds. So I would like to ask the general questions, well, for each of the presenters. Well, what's the contextual moment, well, when you are doing your translation? Well, if you tie these questions, well, to the case of Pema Tseden's work, well, in your translation work, well, so what is the uncontextual moment, well, that you have been confronted with while you are doing your translation? Does it make sense to the questions?
Unless I misunderstood, it seems that I have been saying that I've been plunged, I dive in this context. So as far as I'm concerned, there is, but maybe I misunderstood you, I don't know, but I can't get rid of this context. So the uncontextuality, I'd be indeed happy to hear. I don't know how I deal with it, but I'm aware of it, so maybe it also shapes my translation, and I have no example that come up to my mind now. But I would be curious to hear about the non-contextualization, if this was what you said.
其实我使用的这个我叫做无文脉主义，是这个 non-contextualism。每个 text 每个文本里面都有它自己的语境文脉，但是呢，所以我刚才说过一样，有很多大众小说或者比较具有踏实的结构的小说，比方说莎士比亚。比方说最近的非常流行的一个大众小说、推理小说等等，他们具有他们自己的非常踏实的结构。但是呢，万马才旦的小说呢，往往我觉得比较开放的，比较这个结构不太这么没有那么踏实的。所以我刚才举了个例子了，那部小说是什么？这个一帮人，外国的一帮人来找陌生人，跟题目一样。这个陌生人从哪里来？这个是哪个国家的人？来找卓玛的原因是什么？然后后来最后他到哪里去了？ 这个小说里都没有跟他相关的说明了，他只是来找卓玛，然后他遇到了整整21位卓玛了，但是他终于找不到他愿意的卓玛，到底他愿意的卓玛在哪里？谁都不知道，作者不知道，他不知道，他村里面的人物都不知道，甚至于我们这个读者都不知道。这个卓玛是他到底是谁？所以我把它叫做这个无文脉主义，是这个意思。然后我想说简单的一句话，我想是这个万马才是第一个翻译万马才旦的作品的人，因为他已经把他的藏文作品翻译成中文了，所以。He is the first translator for his own work.
讲一下，虽然对我有些小说，比如说早期的有些小说，他会用2种文字来写，藏文然后中文，但其实我觉得它跟就是普通意义上的翻译是不一样的。我觉得2种文字它有不同的这个特点，然后不同的思维方式，不同的呈现方式，所以。我自己的小说用2种文字写，我自己觉得它不是翻译，就是在用不同的文字创作。但是我也会翻译其他的作家的小说，在翻译他们的作品的时候，我完全是遵循这个翻译的规律，然后完全的会遵循原作者的这个他的语言的风格，他的意象的营造，会完全一个翻译者的一个态度去翻译。所以可能跟把自己的作品变成不同的文字，跟就是把别人的小说翻译成不同的文字，其实有完全不一样的地方。
Yes. Yeah, Dr. Fan.
So thank you so much for all the amazing papers. And so one thing that fascinates me, actually, there are many things that fascinated me, but one thing that struck my mind was the idea raised by Madame Duzan, talking about the idea of like, because one phrase that caught my attention was the idea of reality. And I don't mean just reality in the naive sense of it, but the idea of like reality in general, because, well, I wrote a book on approaching reality. So the idea is that because when we translate or when we transfer an idea from one, basically even from one word to another within the same language or within different registers within the language, we are already changing the way we approach reality. We're changing the knowledge, we're changing the episteme, and we are also shifting the asymmetry at the border between liminal boundaries. And so there are many different things that struck my mind because Madame Duzan's idea of Buddha vivant, it's a great example. Because when you mentioned it, the idea is that, because in Buddhism, the idea is that Shakyamuni Buddha, he was born, he died, so his one body, basically his body in flesh and blood, he was given birth, he died. So there was a Buddha vivant. There was a reincarnation Buddha vivant. But at the same time, the Dharma, the body of the Dharma, didn't have the concept of birth or death. So there is no such concept as Buddha vivant or Buddha mort, for that matter. And then obviously he also, the idea is that he also appears in many different forms, in many circumstances. So in those circumstances, the idea is that are there such phenomena as birth and death in the body of the Buddha, or is there no such thing as the phenomena as the body of the Buddha? Is it a matter of the phenomenon? So all of these ideas, I think the idea is that, for example, even between Tibetan and Chinese, there was already a kind of mistranslation, and there was already a debate between, for example, Tibetan Buddhist scholars and Chinese Buddhist scholars, because through the translation of Kalamuchiva, Gongmo Luo Qizhi, and through Xuanzang, they have already had two very different notions of how this should be done. And I think like each choice of word is so important, not only in terms of nailing down, but what was being conveyed in the host text, in the original text, but also the idea liminality that a choice of words suggests in the process of translation, and eventually also arrives at one very important thing is the authority, right? Because when Françoise talking about the idea that gang in Tibetan, gang means snow, and it is also a name of basically a name for a woman, and so the idea is that the authority has already shifted from the writer in Tibetan to the translator, and also culturally from a Tibetan cultural sphere to kind of more like a transnational cultural sphere. So I guess this is just these are just thoughts that I've been thinking a lot about when I was hearing all the papers. And so it's not really a question per se, but I just find that it's such a interesting discussion and also such an admirable thing that all of you have been doing. Yeah.
Yeah, response, yes.
So to catch on Buddha vivant or living Buddha, Huofo and Truku and everything. And I did say there is no living Buddha because there's no dead Buddha. I use exactly the same image as you did. So the concept is a bit flawed. Anyway, it's not like this in Tibetan at all. And I think as someone who reads Tibetan, even though texts are written in Chinese, I like to raise your attention to keeping... we are in a time of linguistic and cultural, strong linguistic and cultural anxiety in the Tibetan world. I don't need to explain too much. From the film that we've seen yesterday by Pema Tseden, we see there is this deep anxiety about losing Tibetan language, okay? So if we keep Huofo as living Buddha, then it turns Tibetan Buddhism into Chinese Buddhism because you use it in Chinese Buddhism. And it loses its Tibetan nature. And okay, it's written in Chinese, but isn't it, after all, a Tibetan reference, a world of Tibetan references? Same with names. In Enticement, I think it's in Talo. Actually, Talo, I didn't know because it was written in Chinese, and I said, what's this name, Talo? It didn't make sense. So, okay, Talo. Okay, then we put in THRLO because it does not appear in Chinese this way. There's a character, the woman who takes pictures. Her name is Deki, but in Chinese it's Deji. Forgive my non-Chinese, Deji. And here in this book, it is written Deji in 2 syllables, D-E, space, J-I. And if you look at that, it's not a Tibetan name. So I'm always, bickering on my colleagues, say, please, Tibetan names have a proper way of being written in English. Deki is a very common Tibetan name. We should restore it to its as close as possible. We know Chinese is hopeless to render foreign names, honestly, So let's go back to our English rendering, which is much closer to Tibetan, so that these names do not appear as Chinese name as much as Tibetan names, which they are. And this is my plea.
对这个一直有一些争论吧，就是因为它会引起一些误解。然后另一方面，我觉得翻译成这样，可能是为了一个通俗，就是希望别人觉得。就是为了让别人更加的容易了解，然后就用了这样一个活的佛，活着的佛。所以曾经我们的老师也讲过这个事情，然后说这个如果把这个现在的很多活佛翻译成活的佛的话，那其他的就是死去的佛，那也有一个对应的词嘛。所以我觉得这个可能 对，就是翻译上是一个很难的问题。为了别人了解，然后为了别人更加的接受，可能会做一些这样的简化，但是它可能又会引起一些误解。就比如说 living Buddha， 就像活着的佛，就会有一个字面的很大的这样的误解或者曲解在里面。所以一般英文它会一般跟藏文的这个藏文的这个发音是比较接近的，叫这个就是转世的活佛，转世的佛。所以它真正的意义是转世的佛。比如说这个活佛的上一世他已经圆寂了，然后他的灵魂会转世来到这个世上。所以最准确的意思是转世的活，然后藏文的字面的意思也是这样，它是转世成缘来到这个世上的。所以对，从字面理解活佛这个翻译方法肯定是错误的，但是这样的词汇已经普及了。所以对，我觉得这是一个很大的问题。然后就比如说僧人，对僧人，因为可能为了跟汉传佛教或者其他的，比如说其他的传入其他国家的佛教做一个区别，所以藏族的这个僧人，藏传佛教的僧人，一般会翻译成喇嘛，然后一般汉语里面他是僧人嘛。然后在藏语里面，喇嘛又是上师的意思，然后在口语里面也有活佛的意思。就是自己的老师，我们一般会称作喇嘛。然后在汉语的翻译里面，把这个僧人直接翻译成称呼成一个吞称叫喇嘛，这个也是有问题的。但是在这个转变的过程，从一个语言转变到另一个语言的过程，它就会形成这样一些约定俗成的东西。所以这个可能需要更长久的讨论。
Marin, you have something to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say about the names that you mentioned, Tekyi in Tibetan, right? I think that's very important, and we could say the same thing when we are translating Hong Kong literature, right? Would you translate the names in Pinyin, or would you use Cantonese to translate the names, right? It's in this case.
Definitely not Pinyin.
Huh?
Definitely not Pinyin.
Definitely not Pinyin,
Not.
right? And
When you refer to Hong Kongese.
You have a strong feeling when you say
No,
that.
I'm not CAI.
I think it's the same with Tibetan, and I understand your strong feeling about that, right? It's like if someone translated my name into Magdalene or something like that. No, I'm Maialen, which is a Basque name, right? And then the example, so I haven't read the English translation, but now I'm curious. Because the example that you gave about this kang, the snow, right? The idea of authorship was mentioned, that the authorship is shifted to the translator. But at the same time, I think it's a kind of invisible or hidden authorship. Because what happens is that when you read that in the English translation, you're not aware that it's a translation anymore. Because like you said, Pema Tseden would never write kang is snow in Tibetan. So if you say that, you're forgetting that there is a text in Tibetan saying that, and you are making the translation completely invisible by saying something that the source text doesn't say. I don't know if you understand what so you're making the
I think it's just the opposite, because reading something that states, you know it's been translated from Tibetan. I mean, when you read this book, you know this short story is translated from Tibetan. So in any language, you don't say, like if I write in French, I wouldn't take the burden to say, oh, in French, this and this mean that. Because so if you read this in a translation of Tibetan, you become, it's not invisible. For me, it's very visible. It strikes me as stating the obvious. For no Tibetan writer would do that. So on the contrary, it says, oh, this is fishy, you know, what's happening here?
I see what you mean, but at the same time, it could be invisible because you are saying it in English as if it was written in English. So Kang means snow in Tibetan, as if you were saying it in English, because in Tibetan you wouldn't say Kang means snow in Tibetan. So you're saying it in English as if it was written in English, as if there was no source text to refer to. So the translation hasn't happened. That's what I mean by invisible.
Okay, I get your point.
Maybe it's a little bit twisted.
It's a bit twisted, yes. I got it.
Since we are running over time, but I would like to squeeze some time, borrow some time from our coffee break to open to the floor to see any questions, comments, suggestions, and any of our discussions can also join us. Yes, please. Yeah.
A really short and technical question on translation, especially for Maialen. Since you mentioned that in Talo there's a long citation of the article, so the people were meaningful. So I'm really curious whether this article had been translated into Spanish when you started the translation. And if it was, did you just directly quote this article, or did you also make some modulations or additions? Thank you.
Yes, so for the recitation, it has been translated before, obviously, and so I used the version that has been translated because some people are familiar with it. People who have read about Maoism or who are interested are familiar with the translation, and they would refer to the translation. I did make some slight corrections, like if you had weight Gyals instead of pinyin, or transcriptions, things like that I had to fix, or if I saw a typo or a mistake, but they were very small corrections. So I used something that readers would recognize.
Jessica, please.
I'm jumping in because Tsemdo and I also faced this problem with the passage in Wei-Ren-Min-Fu. And when we did the film subtitles, and we had a long discussion about it twice, I think, when we were doing these film subtitles and when we were translating for the book. And I looked at, Tsemdo suggested using the original. And then at first, I didn't like it because, honestly, it's English. And the English is very much in the style of the time when it was translated. It belonged to the style when translators were so keen on preserving every single syntactic tract of the original, obviously done by Wai Guo Youren in Wai-ping Chubanshi. The style really, the style is very problematic, and then sometimes because it's trying to be too faithful, so the meaning becomes very problematic as well. So at first I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to use it. But then I've done it, and then I came back to look at it and look at it and look at it again. Something wasn't right in the way I do it. And then I go back to Tsemdo's suggestion. I put the original one in. And it immediately, the way the passage was used immediately made sense because that was the language of the period. It has nothing to do with the quality of the translation. It hasn't anything to do with what is considered good translation. It has to do with that tone of voice, which is already, Enoch would call it mythology. It belongs to a kind of meaning making, which the form is already in the content. The form is already the content. So you have to have that weird style, which signifies something about how concepts were being formulated in that period of time. I don't know whether
I agree completely, and I had the same. Mine was also Wai-ping Chubanshi, and it was also a little bit, and I was tempted to change things, and I did change. I had the same struggle, so I was changing a lot, then changing less, and at the end I went back to the Wai-ping Chubanshi because, and then you have a contrast as well.
Yes.
That contrast that you have in the story as well. Talo reciting Mao is already a contrast. So yeah.
Paraphrasing a discourse is complicated. Paraphrasing poetry is impossible. So we are struck, when Pema Tseden uses poetry or uses discourses, historical discourses, and songs. What do you do?
I cannot believe this is happening. You actually changed the very word of by Chairman Mao. This is unacceptable.
Maybe we should leave right now. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Bradley Aaron. I'm from the University of Virginia Tibet Center. And actually, I wanted to take advantage of having Pema Tseden here and to ask him a question about his own work. And I'm wondering if he can discuss for us what he sees as the usefulness of the visual medium of the film as a way to translate Tibetan realities for outside audiences, whether that be Chinese or global, whatever that is. And does he see his own work in making this as a director and through being a director as the work of translation? Did you get that? Translator, sorry, I can repeat it. Or Tsemdo can help.
好，万马，你刚才听到问题吗？
对，就是可能没有联想到这个文字翻译这方面，但是它肯定会有一些内在的联系。就比如说，把文字的一个信息转化为影像的信息的时候，肯定是需要做一些处理的。可能有一些文字的东西，它只适合文字来表达，然后有一些影像的东西，它只适合影像来表达。所以，比如说塔洛这个电影，就塔洛他遇见杨错之后，回到了他的山上，然后这个在文字里面其实有很短的描述，就是说塔洛他上山过了1个月就回来了。我觉得这一点可能读者可以通过想象来补充塔洛的生活，但是转述到影像，我觉得那样的补充或者那样的想象，留下那样的空间是不够的，所以要完全转换成另一个语言的系统，就是那个影像的系统。所以那一部分文字只有几十个字，但是我们在描述塔洛在山上的生活的时候，大概用了10几分钟，然后这10几分钟完全是没有对话的，完全就是用影像来呈现。所以我觉得文字跟影像之间有特别大的区别。然后这样的翻译可能不光是比如说从文字到一个影像，或者从一种文字到另一种文字的一个翻译，它可能是它的外延可能更广泛，就比如说一个意象的翻译，或者一些气氛的翻译，可能这些就需要通过影像或者声音来营造出来。所以它跟这种纯粹的文字的翻译其实有很大的区别，所以跟这种纯粹的文学的翻译，我觉得它也是有距离的。所以可能要做这样的转换的时候，就要对两种载体的这种特点，它的表现方式要做特别的了解。比如说文字，它可能有一个文字的一个表达方式，然后影像它有一个影像的表达方式。掌握这2点，我觉得特别重要。然后在翻译的过程中也是，我觉得可能尽可能的，就是比如说文学翻译，如果一个作家、一个小说家，他来翻译另一个小说家的文字的话，我觉得可能是最合适的。所以到目前为止，我自己以前写小说，然后我翻译的也基本上都是小说，我没有翻译过诗歌或者其他的文体。我觉得这样可能你能比较敏感的体味到那个作家他的语感，然后他所营造的一个意象，他的语言的节奏。我觉得这个你可能会比较敏感的感受得到，然后这样才有可能就是一方面在翻译这个小说的内容的同时，也可能把它的这种形式、它的风格比较好的翻译出来。
好， Since time is pressing, we have 11 minutes left for coffee break. But during the break, please go to, we have a booth outside with translations of Talo. So, and just occurred to me that you get a 90% discount. What's the percentage of discount? Okay. Okay, so take your time to get a copy of the book, and we will come back after the coffee break at 4 o'clock. And thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for a good panel.